The clock on the wall showed almost midnight when Lisa finally decided to close the cafe. The working day had been long, and the silence of the night seemed like an invitation to rest. However, something inside her weighed more than physical exhaustion. As he arranged the last of the cups on the counter, his mind echoed the question he had heard hours before: if you could ask God for anything right now, what would it be? The question had come from a regular customer, a man with a serene look and calm words. Elisa, without thinking much, replied, "Peace." But as soon as the word left her mouth, a discreet tear fell onto her apron. What exactly did peace mean? And why did it seem so far away? He had grown up hearing that happiness lay in success, achievements, and recognition. However, even though I had a stable job and a seemingly organized life, the emptiness remained. It seemed like an essential piece was missing from the puzzle of his existence. It was then that he remembered the words he had once heard: "True peace does not come from the world, but from God." The idea sounded strange to him. How could something so abstract fill such a real void? If this message is touching you, remember to share this moment and continue following this journey. Elisa had never been a religious person. I grew up in a home where God was rarely mentioned and where spirituality seemed like a thing of other times. But that night, as he locked the cafe's doors, he realized that he needed to seek answers beyond what he already knew. The silence of the streets seemed to amplify his thoughts. The cold wind cut into her skin, but something deeper disturbed her. If the peace he so desired didn't come from his circumstances, where could he find it? When he got home, he threw himself on the couch and picked up his cell phone. Without knowing exactly what he was looking for, he typed, "How to find inner peace." Among the various results, one verse caught his attention: "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give it to you as the world gives it." John 14 verse 27. That intrigued her. Why would Jesus make this distinction? Was there then a different kind of peace than the one the world offered? If so, how could I try it? In the following days, that question wouldn't leave his mind. During work, while serving customers and taking orders, she found herself distracted, reflecting on that promise. Maybe there was something bigger waiting to be discovered. But what was stopping her from finding that peace? The weight of worries? Doubts? Or perhaps the feeling that I wasn't worthy of something so great? In the midst of these questions, another memory came to light: the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Philippians 4 verse 7. If this peace existed and went beyond human understanding, perhaps it was not something to be achieved by effort, but received in another way. However, accepting this idea was not easy. He had always believed that everything depended solely on his own effort, that nothing came without merit. How could I simply receive something so valuable without needing to prove my worth? Over the course of the week, his search intensified. He started paying more attention to conversations, to small signs around him. And, interestingly, it seemed like everything was pointing in the same direction, an invitation to trust something bigger than herself. On one of those days, a customer had left a book on the table. The title was simple but intriguing: Rest for the Soul. Without thinking much, Elisa flipped through a few pages and found a quote that resonated with her: "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11 verse 28. The fatigue he carried was not just physical. It was an exhaustion of the soul, a weight that words could not describe. What if this promise was real? What if there was someone willing to ease this burden? For the first time, he considered the possibility that perhaps he was looking for peace in the wrong place. The world offered distractions, promises of temporary happiness, but none of that truly filled his soul. It was then that he realized his search was not for something external, but for a lost connection, something that his soul longed for, but could not name. "You made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you," Augustine had said centuries before. Elisa's journey was just beginning. For the first time, she was willing to give space to the possibility that God might be the answer she sought. But to do that, I would need to open my heart to something new, something I had never experienced before. His mind was still full of questions. What would this delivery be like? What would need to change in your life? Could I really trust God, even without fully understanding it? The clock said midnight again. But this time, instead of restlessness, I felt something different. It was not yet the complete peace he desired, but a spark of hope. And maybe that was the first step. Dawn brought a new weight to Elisa's thoughts. What was once just a concern now became a real search. It was as if something was awakening inside her, something that could no longer be ignored. On the way to the cafe, I watched people rushing through the streets. Some seemed full of worries, others smiled for no apparent reason. What differentiated one from the other? Could it be possible that some of them had already found the peace they were looking for? Throughout the day, these questions continued to echo. During a break from work, he decided to research more about the verses he had found. He discovered that, according to the scriptures, true peace was not just an emotional state, but a fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faith. Galatians 5 verse 22. This meant that peace was not something she could manufacture alone. It was a reflection of God's presence in his life. But how to allow this presence? An uncomfortable thought arose. What if she had never found peace because she had always avoided that path? Elisa realized that, for years, she had built her life without considering God. Could this be the reason for the persistent emptiness? At night, when he got home, he decided to do something different. He took a notebook and wrote down everything he felt. Fears, doubts, desires. Everything that he had kept for himself for a long time. As he wrote, he remembered another verse he had read, casting all your care on him, because he cares for you, 1 Peter 5 verse 7. The idea of giving your worries to God seemed strange, but at the same time, it brought an unexpected lightness. Elisa had never prayed before. I didn't quite know how to do that. But, closing his eyes, he just tried to speak, as best he could. If the Lord really exists, I want to understand. I want to find that peace. No thunder sounded, no audible response came from the sky. But something inside her seemed to quiet for a moment. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The next day, a customer left a note next to his coffee cup. Don't worry about anything, instead, pray about everything, Philippians 4 verse 6. The ticket had no signature. Elisa looked around, but didn't see anyone who seemed to have left it. Was it a coincidence? Or was there something beyond that? Either way, those words stayed with her for the rest of the day. For the first time, he thought that maybe God was really trying to get his attention. In the following days, he continued his search. He began watching videos and reading about people who had found peace through faith. Many of these stories were about surrender. Not an abandonment of oneself, but a surrender to the will of God. One of Dr. Stanley's teachings resonated strongly. God's peace is not based on circumstances, but on trust. You can be in the middle of a storm and still have peace if you know that God is in control. That made sense to Elisa. His life has always been an attempt to maintain control, to keep things from falling apart. But what if, instead of trying to hold everything in, she learned to trust? Once again, he remembered the words of Jesus, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good courage, I have overcome the world," John 16 verse 33. The promise was not of the absence of problems, but of a peace that existed despite them. That night, when she looked at the starry sky, she felt small in the face of the immensity. But at the same time, a different sensation enveloped her. What if God really was there, had always been there, just waiting for her to notice him? It was a new thought, almost frightening, but also comforting. If peace came from a relationship with God, then that meant she needed to know him. Not just in theory, but in reality. Elisa's search was just beginning, but it was no longer just a question. Now, it was a calling. Something inside her told her there was more to discover, more to experience. His mind still had questions, but his heart was already beginning to find answers. Perhaps true peace was not a distant goal, but an invitation that was always within reach. And at that moment, she finally had the courage to accept this invitation. The next morning, Elisa woke up with a different feeling. It wasn't exactly the peace I was looking for, but relief, as if I had taken a step in the right direction. For the first time, instead of getting lost in worries, he decided to start the day with a simple prayer: "Lord, show me the way." The day went by normally at the cafe, but his perception of things was changing. He began to notice how the people around him wore tired expressions, blank stares. Before, I thought it was just part of the routine, but now I saw something beyond it, a restlessness similar to the one I felt. While serving a customer, he heard someone at the next table say, "No matter what I do, it's never enough. There is always one more worry, one more problem." The sentence hit hard. That's exactly how he felt until recently. He then remembered a teaching from Dr. Stanley: true peace comes not from what we possess or what we accomplish, but from the certainty that God cares for us, regardless of the circumstances. This truth was starting to make sense. Until then, he had tried to find peace in control, security, and stability. But maybe I was looking in the wrong place. After all, how many people had all this and still lived in anguish? At the end of the day, he sat down at one of the empty tables in the cafe and opened the notebook where he had written his anguish days before. But this time, he felt like writing something different. Not about fears, but about gratitude. She picked up her pen and wrote down, "Today, for the first time, I realize that I am not alone. I feel like there is something bigger guiding me. And even though I don't understand everything, I'm grateful for this new hope." As he closed his notebook, he remembered the words of Philippians 4 verse 9, "And the God of peace will be with you." It wasn't just about finding peace, but about learning to live it. But how can you maintain this peace on a daily basis? How to stop worries from dominating your thoughts again? Elisa knew that this transformation would not happen overnight. It needed to be cultivated. When researching more on the subject, he found a fundamental principle: peace comes from communion with God. Pray, meditate on the Word, trust His plans. In one of his readings, he came across another quote from Dr. Stanley: "Peace is not a passing feeling, but a state of mind built through an ongoing relationship with God." This idea impacted her. He had always looked for quick solutions, but now he understood that peace was not something that could be found and ready. It was a process, a daily journey. He then decided to make small changes. Separate a moment of the day to reflect and pray. Read an excerpt from the Bible every morning. Practice gratitude. Small steps that would help her keep her heart aligned with this new perspective. Little by little, she noticed something curious. The same situations that previously took her off track began to lose strength. The worries still existed, but they no longer dominated her in the same way. And then, a new question arose: how to share this peace with others? After all, if so many people around her seemed to be carrying the same burden that she was carrying before, there would be no point in keeping it to herself. It was then that he remembered Jesus' words: "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God," Matthew 5 verse 9. Being a peacemaker meant not only finding peace but also spreading it. He decided to start with small gestures, listening carefully to someone, offering words of encouragement, helping without expecting anything in return. Little by little, what once seemed like a personal quest began to become a purpose. And, to his surprise, the more he shared this peace, the more it grew within him. The transformation that once seemed impossible was now real. Not because his life was perfect, but because his perspective had changed. And that was how Elisa, without realizing it, found what she had always been looking for. Peace was not in the answers, but in the trust that God would always be by her side, leading her, day after day. Elisa's routine hasn't changed drastically. She still worked at the same cafe, served the same customers, and walked the same streets. But something inside her was different. The anxiety that once dominated her had not completely disappeared, but it no longer had the same power over her days. For the first time, I felt like I had found a firm foundation, something that didn't depend on external circumstances. However, realizing that peace was an ongoing state and not an isolated moment was a challenge. There were days when she felt strong and confident, but on others, the old insecurities tried to return. On one of these nights, as he looked out the window of his small apartment, a thought occurred to him: the peace that comes from God does not mean the absence of challenges, but the presence of trust. This idea resonated with what I had read recently: "You will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you," Isaiah 26 verse 3. The secret was not to avoid problems, but to keep your gaze fixed on the Creator, regardless of the circumstances. But how could you strengthen that trust? Elisa realized that this new journey required dedication. Peace was not just a gift to be received, but a state of mind that needed to be cultivated. So he decided to be intentional about his faith. He started setting aside time every morning to reflect, pray and be grateful, even when he didn't feel like it. Over time, he began to notice the effects of this change. The days still brought challenges, but now she faced them differently. Before, when something went wrong at work or a worry arose, your mind would go into a whirlwind of anxious thoughts. Now, whenever this happened, he remembered Jesus' words, "Do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself." Matthew 6 verse 34. This new mindset brought with it an unexpected lightness. She learned that she didn't need to have all the answers, nor control every situation. His responsibility was to do his part, but the rest was to be given to God. One of the biggest challenges was learning to trust when things didn't go as expected. A mistake at work once caused an important client to complain. The old impulse to blame herself and despair almost took over, but Elisa took a deep breath and said a short prayer, "Lord, help me deal with this wisely." To his surprise, the situation was resolved without any major consequences. Little by little, she realized that God did not free her from her problems, but gave her the strength to face them in a different way. As Dr. Stanley said, God may not change your circumstances, but He will always change you through them. This made her understand that true peace is not fragile. It's not like a sandcastle that collapses at the slightest sign of a storm. Rather, it is a fortress built on trust and relationship with God. This transformation did not go unnoticed. Coworkers began to notice his calmer demeanor, his renewed patience. Some even asked what had changed, and she, without needing long speeches, just smiled and said, "I'm learning to trust God more." The peace she had found was not just a personal benefit. He began to realize that, when he maintained his serenity, his presence affected the environment around him. Clients fidgeted less when talking to her, colleagues seemed more at ease. It was as if the peace he carried within him overflowed. Then, he realized something even deeper. Peace was not just a gift that God gave, but a reflection of Him in his life. Just as a mirror reflects the light it receives, his peace was a reflection of his closeness to the Creator. This truth made her better understand Jesus' words, "You are the light of the world," Matthew 5 verse 14. The peace he had found was not to be kept, but to enlighten those around him. However, this journey did not mean that he would never face difficulties again. On the contrary, I knew that life would still bring challenges. But now he understood that his strength was not in avoiding problems, but in trusting in the presence of God in the midst of them. In one of his moments of prayer, he reflected on what he had learned. Before, I believed that peace came when everything was under control. Now, I saw that true peace was trusting even when nothing seemed under control. It was resting in the fact that God saw what she didn't see and took care of what she couldn't control. This certainty changed his way of living. He stopped worrying excessively about the future, because he understood that security was not in his own hands, but in God's. As Romans 8 verse 28 says, "We know that all things work together for good to those who love God." Now, his peace did not depend on financial stability, professional success, or recognition from people. It was something deeper, a firm anchor amidst the storms of life. She finally understood that she didn't need to carry the weight of the world alone. And so, Elisa concluded that the peace she sought so much was always within her reach. It was not something distant or unattainable, but a constant invitation from God to trust Him. Her journey was not over, but now she knew she would never have to walk alone again.